you do a keyword search on the surge in Google, and along with NYPD and police department, what you likely find are a number of links to Iraq, even though you include the keywords NYPD and police department. If you do a keyword search on YouTube for the surge in NYPD and police department, I believe you'll find a number of videos that actually deal with a relatively new tactic that's recently been rolled out by the police department, where basically you have approximately 50 to 60 police vehicles swarming on a place where there has been no crime that's been occurred, that where no crime has occurred. Now, this type of thing used to be common in working class and poor neighborhoods in New York City, just to kind of round up quote unquote reasonable uh, the usual suspects, and it's been used as a heavy-handed approach in their attempt to deal with the war on drugs. But now you see it rolled out in much more in a wide variety of places within the city. So the first time I actually saw it was the first time I was in New York City as an adult in the summer. Was Memorial Day weekend, and it occurred in downtown Manhattan, where I saw 50 to 60 police cars converge on one place, and they were just there, right? So it wasn't like something happened. I thought something might have happened, but I had heard about the surge, this tactic from a graduate student. So once I saw it, I realized what was going on. So then 50 to 60 police cars, they stop, and then all those police officers, they get out, and they're just in like they're in formation, and the lead police officer is talking to them, and I overhear some of what they're saying, and he's talking to them about how police officers don't necessarily like the citizens, and the citizens don't necessarily like them, right? And that's not really the point. The point is that we're here to actually protect them, even though they may not actually want or desire our form of protection. What happens when you actually embed those types of tactics and policies within a police department that's supposedly supposed to protect and serve a population? When you embed those policies and tactics, what you really create is not so much a police force, but a policing force, and a force that is actually much more like an occupying force than they are like like the police we would see on Andy Griffith, right? Now, how does that play a role in the Sean Bell case? There are at least two different dynamics. One dynamic is that when you've got these norms and rules and regulations that make the police out to be something they shouldn't be, when a case like this happens, those norms, rules, and regulations become the sole or primary determinants of guilt and or innocence, particularly in this case when a jury is not involved. The only person who decided the merits of this case was Justice Cooperman of the State Supreme Court out of Queens. So when you take a jury out of this, and the prosecution, or rather the defense, is relying on norms, rules, and regulations, whereas the jury would be much more likely to say, well, listen, let's think about these norms, rules, and regulations as they are applied and as they're encountered by just regular citizens. More likely, you're going to focus on those norms, rules, and regulations and use those to figure out what the reasonable police officer would have done, as opposed to what the reasonable citizen should have expected from the police officer, right? So in this case, it's very clear that Justice Cooperman was much more invested in figuring out whether in the violations of the various norms and rules and regulations the police actually did something that was criminal, right? So I was trying to figure out an analogy that would best work here to describe what's going on. And the best analogy I could come up with is if you had a guy who was responsible for fixing a car, and somebody actually died as a result of the guy forgetting the guy not putting brakes in the car. In one case, you have a guy who didn't put brakes in the car because he knew the individual who was driving it and didn't like the individual driving it and maliciously decided not to put brakes in the car, right? In the other case, you have a guy who just kind of sort of accidentally through the course of business kind of sort of forgot to put the brakes on the car. In the first case, it's easy that the individual is going to be tried for manslaughter and found guilty. In the second case, it's likely that the auto shop that the guy works in is going to have to pay the family some loot, but it's unlikely that the individual, particularly if the reason the individual forgot to put brakes in, if that forgetting came as a consequence of carrying out normal duties, then that person probably won't be found guilty. He might not have a job, but he's not going to be found guilty. And I think that's the type of thing that's at work here. In fact, if you think about it, it was the exact same type of thing that was at work in 1992 with Rodney King. So it wasn't about whether Rodney King had a right to be protected from the type of treatment that was levied on him. It was more about what was reasonable. What would the reasonable police officer do in that case, right? What would the reasonable police officer do? So in this case, if we had a jury and if we had a focus more on the normal person, then it seems to me in that case it will be clear that something like an undercover police officer pulling a weapon at 4 a.m. and brandishing that weapon against an individual, it would seem to me in that case what that individual should reasonably expect in 4 a.m. from somebody who is plain clothes pulling out a gun, and what that person would do in that case, right? I mean, that's what it seems to me. So when you combine the focus on norms, rules, and regulations with the context of New York, where those norms, rules, and regulations have produced what's kind of like a quasi-military force that's more designed to police bodies than they are to actually serve and protect, then this type of verdict is pretty much a foregone conclusion. And then what you do is you add to that fact the unique characteristics of Sean Bell. So those of us who deal with racial politics, who deal with black politics, who just live with being black, most of us have stories about police encounters, at least most men. But the thing that's important to recognize here is that there's variance when police officers are actually dealing with black men. That is to say that police officers don't treat all black men the same, because not all black men actually represent the same degree of threat. So I actually had to deal with this myself. Like over the past year or so, I've been stopped by the police like 4 times. In one case, not only did I not have a license, I didn't have a photo ID in general, I didn't have proof of insurance, I didn't have registration, and I didn't know whose car I was driving. It's a long story, it's legit, but I didn't, right? And I didn't even get a ticket. Why? Part of it was because the case was so absurd, but part of it was because I didn't fit the demographics. I'm older than 35, it's clear I'm middle-aged. I performed my class in a way that the guy knew I wasn't, the guy knew I was not only educated, but I was highly educated. You can't see this from looking at me from the neck up, but I weigh 150 pounds dripping wet, and I'm brown skin rather than dark skin. All those individual pieces come into play in determining who's going to be viewed as a victim or who's going to be viewed as a potential threat in a quick second and who won't be, right? And those are the type of things that I think really stood out to me. So in that case, it becomes even harder for the judge to actually look at Sean Bell, because what he's thinking of is that he's thinking that the police have actually in some ways a right to view someone like Sean Bell as a threat. And those are my preliminary thoughts. More later.